who is president of the University of Louisiana System, which is a job he's held since January 1st, 2017. Before that, he was president of his alma mater, Northwestern State University, and he also was chancellor of Bossier Parish Community College. In 2012, he was named a Northwest Louisiana Business Hall of Fame laureate, and in 2017, he was inducted into Northwestern State's Hall of Honor, the Long Purple Line. His proudest accomplishment to date, though, is the tiny blue check next to his Twitter handle. And if you aren't following Dr. Henderson on Twitter, you should. He has a Master of Science degree in Administration from the University of West Florida and a Doctor of Management from the University of Maryland University College. He's married to his college sweetheart, Tanya, who is a proud Cajun from Baton. They have 3 children, and if you follow him on Twitter, you'll know they have 3 grandchildren, and he posts some of the most adorable pictures of them. Please welcome Dr. Henderson.
Thank you very much. Well, good afternoon. It's a pleasure to be with you. I have to extend thanks not only to the Press Club for inviting me to speak, but to the 30 or 40 others that were on vacation and couldn't come speak. And so I got to be the one selected, and it is it's a real pleasure to be here. I also want to recognize, because this is the Press Club, and I kind of fumbled this at our last board meeting when it occurred to me the date. It was the 50th anniversary not only of Title IX, but it was the 50th anniversary of the press coverage of the Watergate break-in. And what a seminal moment that was in journalism. And as a journalism student who's surrounded by mass comm, but they're journalism students as well, that's just a moment of pride. And it's also a moment to reflect on just how serious this profession is and how important you are as the fourth estate. I hope you will forgive my voice. This is seasonal allergy. I made the mistake of buying too much Allegra D at one time, and now they won't sell it to me for about another 30 days. And whatever the allergies are, they've got my voice, but I promise you I am COVID negative, and I hope the rest of us are as well. But I want to give you just a little bit of a recap of a couple of things, remind you of a couple of initiatives that we have in place, and probably unveil to many of you for the first time a very foundational piece of our work. Now, we are just wrapped up a few weeks ago, our legislative session. And as you've all seen, it's been reported widely, it was a tremendously successful session for higher education in terms of reinvestment in our work, investment in faculty salaries. But for us as the UL system, when you weigh the investments of resources, the capital investments in our system, which include elevating our New Iberia Research Center with UL Lafayette to a biohazard level 3 research site, and the implications that carries for this now Carnegie R1 institution. The expansions of nursing facilities here in Baton Rouge at our southeastern campus and in the Hammond campus and in Nichols. The investments in academic facilities at ULM, at Louisiana Tech, and at Northwestern State. And investments in infrastructure at Grambling and McNeese and UNO. It was, with the policy initiatives we were able to pass, this is arguably the most successful legislative session since our system was founded in 1974. That's how big it was. And you'll hear us talk a lot well, yeah, thank you. I'll wait for the applause to die down now. Quite often it's about resources, right? And resources are important, but really it's about elevating the importance of higher education to our citizens, to our emerging citizens, the young folks, if you will, to our older folks, those that are in the workplace that may not have a college degree, our employers who are the ones who employ our graduates, or hopefully one day will compete with our graduates. You know, we have a $10.9 billion economic impact on the state of Louisiana, and that's not insignificant. But during that legislative session, there were some policy enhancements that I think that are worthy of note. And there's been some great coverage of Representative Freiberg's hunger-free campus legislation. And that's kind of a hidden problem, is the food insecurity that faces so many college students, not only those in our general public, but those that come to college. And for those of us who remember going to college when you could work for 300 hours during the summer and cover the cost of attendance, both your housing, your food, and your tuition and fees, and realize today, just for tuition and fees, you have to work over 2,100 hours, which is a full-time job. So we shouldn't be that surprised to see food insecurity as a problem facing college students. And I was so happy to see Representative Freiberg and her leadership in developing this designation for campuses. But one that was kind of under the radar, didn't get a single negative vote throughout the process, was Amy Freeman's from the New Orleans area bill to expand the usage of crisis leave. Now, a lot of folks may not understand this. In government, we accrue leave and we maintain that leave in perpetuity. And so some of us who have been here for a long time and typically don't get sick and don't take vacations, we accrue a significant amount of leave. We can donate that leave to a crisis pool in our agency. And every agency develops their policies around this crisis pool. That way, if someone who may not have sufficient leave gets sick with a prolonged illness or has a family member that gets a prolonged illness, they're able to draw from that pool, and it's a great financial scaffolding, if you will. Well, this year, we were able to add to the available uses of crisis leave, maternity leave. Now, I want you to think about the implications for that. When you look at our system, those who are most likely to take maternity leave are typically female faculty members at the beginning of their career. Those who are most likely to not have built up sufficient leave to cover 12 weeks of maternity leave, and those who are most likely to be derailed because of the challenges that can come from that. Now we have a policy in place that allows us to create that scaffolding, that support system around our female faculties and male faculty who are faced with this wonderful opportunity that sometimes can be sated by the financial implications. And so very, very proud of that achievement. Cami Geisman from our office, Michelle Caruso from Nicholls State were the ones who pushed this legislation, and of course Representative Freeman was extraordinarily helpful. Senator Milligan from Shreveport, Bossier area, DeSoto Parish area, passed a bill to protect intellectual property. And those of you who may not be watching, the main culprit, and there's a number of bad actors at the national level, rogue regimes, if you will, nefarious actors like the Chinese Communist Party that have dedicated programs to steal intellectual property from especially research institutions. And so we worked closely with Senator Milligan and members of the Department of Homeland Security to craft a bill that adds protections around that intellectual property, but without infringing on academic freedom and scholarship, and certainly keeping the onus on the state actors and not on the scholars of those nationalities. And that was very important to us, is to get that language right. And Senator Milligan was extraordinarily accommodating to us, very receptive to us. The folks from federal law enforcement, even our local FBI, worked very closely with us, understanding what our concerns were, and then achieving something of significance. And the last one I'll mention to you is Chuck Owens, also from North Louisiana, a graduate of Louisiana Tech, passed another bill to expand free expression on college campuses. And you know, college campuses have long been the bastion of free expression, free speech since our very founding. That's really at our core. But I dare say we're in a place now that we haven't seen since the 1960s, where the passions around issues, whether they're Supreme Court rulings, or if they're issues of social justice, or if there's issues around politics that have inflamed these passions, we expect our college campuses to be very, very active in people's exercising of their First Amendment rights. Now, I, for one, as a former campus rabble-rouser, kind of loved that idea. It gets my juices flowing. But I remember T. Joe Savoy texting me one day. He says, listen, this morning I got up, put a seat outside the president's house. We had a pro-life rally, followed by a pro-choice rally, followed by a Back to Blue rally, followed by a Black Lives Matter parade. He goes, it's a great day to be a college president. And I said, yeah, it really is. But we just sent the new policy to our presidents and reiterated to them that that's what we are, bastions of free expression. And while sometimes that can be civil discourse, it's really exciting and get your juices flowing, a lot of times it's discourse that is far from civil and even offensive. And while that can be challenging for us to manage, it's part of who we are. And it's the price we pay to have that free expression that is so sanctus, that we hold sacred. And so we hope that message has been given out and appropriate. But again, we expect to see some lively banter on our campuses this coming fall, especially since this is a mid-year election at the federal level. Next year is a gubernatorial election, and the year after that's a presidential election. It's not going to be short term by any means. If I could transition a little bit to system work, it's been 5.5 years that I've been in this work. The worst decision I ever made was leaving the presidency of my alma mater, which is the greatest job a person can have. It takes you about 2 hours longer at the Natchitoches Walmart because you have a number of conversations. But other than that, it's a great job. But the system, as board members are asking me if it would be something I'd be interested in, I had conversations with my fellow university presidents, and one of them was John Crane from Southeastern. I asked him, John, I said, what is the UL system? And he says, well, you have 2 land-grant systems in LSU and Southern University, and then you have the community college system, which is the 2-year programs and the technical schools, and the UL system is everything else. I said, well, John, you're not going to be involved in our slogans and our messaging. What a compelling, passionate exercise it is to be in charge of everything else. And so we realized we had a challenge on our hands, that we had to really develop this notion of system and what it means to be a system, and what's the power of 9 distinct universities, each with a rich history, its own alumni base, its own student base, and to leverage those institutions towards the collective good, towards educational attainment, towards workforce and economic development, all of which are based in human development. We engaged our board, and our board members, even though they've transitioned significantly over the last 6 years, collectively as a board, it's their evolution into doing truly generative work. If you think about the 3 modes of governance for boards, you have fiduciary, which is just responsible for your resources. Strategic, which is thinking about legislative processes and what we're going to do for the next year. But what separates a normal board from a truly exemplary board is the ability to shift to what we call generative thinking, and thinking about what's coming next over the next decade. That's what I'm most proud of with our board, and it's that work, that systemic work, that has allowed us to create some pretty significant initiatives, one of which the Reginald F. Lewis Scholars Program. You'll see on this roll-up, thank you, Cammie, I didn't know the jargon, this piece of paper here, the Reginald F. Lewis Scholars Program. We realized from our data that the individuals that were most likely to not succeed in our institutions or face barriers were black males. And so we've got to do something that addresses the specific needs if we're going to be successful and elevate all boats. Well, I happened to have done a research paper back in 1989 or so on the first black billionaire, a man who invented the leveraged buyout, a man who came up from humble beginnings on the streets of Baltimore, went to Virginia State, and was the first person ever, and maybe the only person ever, admitted to Harvard Law School without applying. He went to a summer workshop there. The faculty were so impressed with him, they enrolled him at Harvard Law. He began his career as a lawyer on Wall Street. He saw all the money. It was exchanging hands, and while he was doing well, he wasn't doing where he should have been. So he created this idea called the leveraged buyout and bought a $1 billion European food conglomerate called Beatrice Foods. He is the model of a self-starter. He's the model of someone who's innovating, takes his own economic destiny in his hands, and being successful. Well, I got a call from a board member and said, have you ever heard of Reginald Lewis? I said, well, yeah, I know a little bit about Reginald Lewis. He goes, well, good. I'm having dinner with his widow, Loida Lewis, today. And do you think there's any room for a partnership? We brought Loida down to our system conference in Lafayette. We introduced her to our universities. We introduced her to our students. We introduced her to our faculty and staff. And she said, absolutely, you can use my husband's name on the Reginald F. Lewis Equity Initiative. As we moved that initiative forward, we came up with this idea that we were going to identify rising black males from each of our institutions, and we have 2 from each institution. As they rise to be sophomores, we created a curated educational experience for them that includes internships and mentorships and a retreat. It's going to include study abroad. We took 2 of them to Paris, to Sorbonne, and think about the Sorbonne and the majesty of the Sorbonne, right there on the banks of the Seine. It opened in 1250, 634 years before my alma mater opened in Natchitoches, right? And people wanted to go to the University of Paris Sorbonne because it was the pathway for social mobility. And as I'm standing there with Ebenezer Agri, the scholar from Northwestern State, and we're looking at a mural of Pascal and Descartes in a debate. And then we go and we stand under a statue of Louis Pasteur and one of Marie Curie. These are just some of the faculty that have been associated with Sorbonne. 33 Nobel Prize laureates, 6 Fields medalists. And they're on this campus. All of a sudden you see his eyes open with wonder, and then you see them narrow a bit when he starts thinking about the opportunities that come. So they'll all be going back next spring, and they'll listen to lectures from the academies of science and academies of arts about the origins of democracy and understanding why, when we had our Constitution in 1789 and the French had their revolution, we're still on our first republic when they're on their 9th. And what are the forces that make that happen? And what are the foundations of science? How do you build this new level of understanding? Right? It was not too long ago when we start talking about academic freedom, when Galileo was in prison, house arrest for the rest of his life, for proposing the absurd sentiment that the earth revolves around the sun instead of the opposite. Right? That's what academic freedom is about. They'll get to the essence of that and understand that, and we think it's going to be part of building that cultural competence in these young men as they go forward. It's this generative thinking that led to Compete Louisiana, when we identified 653,000 Louisianans that have some college and no degree. And how do we create an intake system or a support system that allows these folks to come back to school and complete what they started, and more importantly, to take control of their own destinies in terms of work, in terms of life. And Compete Louisiana is something that I'm very excited about. We have already had 179 graduates over the last 3 years, and you think we have 4-year degrees, that's pretty impressive. We expect that number to go up significantly over the next coming years. But I'm talking to you about all these programs and the need to grow the number of college graduates, but really this is the most important part, is understanding the why. And I'll be honest, it was one of those light bulb moments for me when I was visiting with the leadership of DXC Technology, as they were planning to build a new enterprise right in the central business district of New Orleans. It's a technology firm, so I was there prepared to showcase our computer information systems and our computer science programs and our cyber programs, and they're world class, truly world class. And they said, you know, that's great, we want to meet with all those graduates, but we also want to meet the graduates of your music programs. I said, well, why would DXC Technology have any interest in music program graduates? Until you start understanding their business model and you understand the experience of a music student. Think about an orchestra where you're there and you've accomplished, you've mastered your instrument, you've mastered the music that's in front of you, but your success is contingent upon being in harmony with the people on either side of you and the person across from you. And not a single member of that orchestra can be successful unless the entire team is successful. And that's the business model in a lot of technology firms. They can teach new workers how to press particular buttons, and they can introduce them to emerging technologies. What they can't develop in them is that core competency of teamwork and creative thinking that comes. And that was just a light bulb moment for me. So we brought a group of faculty from all of our institutions together and said, listen, I want to know what it means to be a graduate from one of our universities. I know that when you graduate from an accounting program, you've met the requirements to sit for the CPA exam. Or when you graduate from a nursing program, you're now prepared to go into the field of nursing. But what about our other programs? And what about these programs in general? Are you just learning these discipline-specific skill sets? And the answer to that is quite obviously no. And that's been a part of the academy for a long time. But what we have failed to do is to articulate it in a way that can be digested by the general public, even by our own faculty and by students. And so after 2.5 years, some of it interrupted by COVID-19, they unveiled to us what we call the core competencies. These are the competencies that are the foundation that will underlie every degree we produce at our 9 institutions. And some of them are traditional ones, the communication competence, the ability to communicate with those in front of you, whether it's a group or whether it's an individual, to use various means of communication, to understand that we now have microphones in our hands that we carry around with us that connect with anyone on the globe through social media in both positive and negative ways, right? Creative and critical problem solving, taking new novel approaches to solving these issues that have plagued us for a long time. But a couple of new ones that we put on here that I thought were really interesting. One was adaptable resilience. And I think about the 17,500 students that graduated from us in academic year 2020-2021 who demonstrated adaptable resilience as their whole world was turned upside down and their educational experience changed from what they had predicted it would be. And how do you capture that competence that they built as part of that experience? That's adaptable resilience. Cultural competence, and this is part of the study abroad program that we have in place, is preparing students to work with people that come from different experiential backgrounds, different belief systems, different origin stories, if you will. And that doesn't mean that you change what's your core, what is your ideal, what you hold dear and sacred to yourself, but it also means that you're able to work effectively and constructively with people that come from completely different backgrounds, and how much stronger that can make you if you have that cultural competence. And the last one was self-reflective awareness. And this is hard, especially for those of us that are partially educated and think we know what we're talking about all the time. The ability to reflect on what you don't know. The ability to reflect on your own cognitive limitations. The fact that you don't have the information. There is a reason that algorithms work on Facebook. It's because they just bombard you with stories and information that confirm what you want to believe. And how does that put us hardness into our positions? How does that start to strengthen the extremes and put noise in the middle, right? Now, my mother is one of the most learned people I know. She got her doctorate at University of Arkansas in education, and then later went on to get her master's of library science, University of Oklahoma. I remember my brothers and I, we were young and at home. We said, "Mom, why do you need a master's degree to learn how to check out books?" And then she made us read her thesis. And I understood what it meant to be a library scientist. And she's so learned. And I went to visit her. She stays in assisted living, and her television stays on one channel. And she started inundating me with all the wisdom that she's gotten from this one channel. And because I can't help myself, I said, "Well, but what about?" And it didn't go well, right? She's in her mid-80s. She is fine to believe everything she wants to believe, that's fine. But for those that are merging into society, that have to be part of building what comes next for the next generations, they have to be able to distill information. They have to be able to be skeptical, especially when they're told something that they want so desperately to believe. And that's what self-reflective awareness is going to do. When we put these 5 core competencies and embed them into the knowledge, skills, and abilities associated with specific disciplines, then you have someone that is truly able to determine not only their economic future, but their future in life, in satisfaction, to be able to contribute not only to the employers and to the economy, but contribute to community. And I could not be more excited about this work. The work begins now in implementing this at each of our campuses, and it's going to look a little bit different at each one because they all have a different culture and a different faculty, and that's one of the strengths, right? It can be embedded into a great books curriculum, or it can be embedded into an education curriculum at Southeastern or at Northwestern. And we believe that this is the foundation of our work. It's going to be the foundation for Louisiana for generations to come. It's going to enable us to then address the societal, the political, the community concerns that face us in the future. I'm so bullish on the future of our universities, and more importantly on the future of our system, because we're doing purposeful work that advances quality of life for Louisianans. And really, that's the core of our mission. And folks, with that, I'd be happy to answer any questions that you might have for me. Thank you. I was hoping Jim Inkster would ask me about Joe Delaney.
What channel was your mom watching?
You know, I don't see as well as I used to, and the screen wasn't high res. I couldn't tell. I believe it was PBS. Or some iteration of that.
After such a high-flung discussion, could I be a little more pedestrian?
Of course, yes, sir.
Let's talk about the status of well, every campus is affected by the hurricanes that we've had recently, but there's a couple of campuses that have been just slammed. How is that working out? How is the interface with FEMA and the whole complexity that has been thrown at us since 2020?
So when I got a text from Daryl Burkell at about 2:30 in the morning in August of 2020 that said, it's usually not good news when a university president texts me at 2:20 in the morning, said, well, the roof just came off of this building, so we're moving to a safer building. And that, of course, was Hurricane Laura. And then 6 weeks later, all the blue tarps were pulled off those windows, and Hurricane Delta dumped 14 inches of rain into those buildings. And then they were met with a winter storm in Lake Charles, and then a flood. It seems like every year we're having a storm of the century there. And of course, this last year with Hurricane Ida that came up, luckily for some, it took a right-hand turn about 30 miles south of Nicholls State and came up through a less populated area. It could have decimated that campus. It did do some damage at University of New Orleans, did some damage at Southeastern. John Crane is probably our best operational president. Each one has their own strengths. I get to Southeastern 2 days after the storm, and every piece of debris had been cleaned up and was neatly stacked along the side of the road. And I said, John, you can't clean it up before FEMA gets here because they're going to lower the amount that they're going to refund you. But that's just the price of being very efficient in your work. Those campuses became bastions for their regions. And I look at the recovery that's occurred at McNeese. Daryl Burkell told me that they were going to be back in classrooms that January. And while at that moment you don't want to dispel somebody's wishes, especially their optimism, I thought there's no way they're going to be back on this campus for maybe another year. But they were back on that campus at about 40% in that spring. And by the next fall, they had 90% of their buildings back in operation. Now, they do have some buildings that were becoming obsolete. This is an opportunity to upgrade those and move them aside. I have to say this, the apparatus around facilities in Louisiana, I went through the same thing in 2005. It was 3 months after I took a job with Community College System, and we had Hurricane Katrina and Hurricane Rita. The responsiveness, the efficiency, the coordination in this experience is you could not have hoped that this would be the experience now. The communications have been great, the coordination among various agencies to get buildings started and moving forward quickly, and this includes even the federal group. But facility planning and control, the Commissioner of Administration, Jay Darden, of course the governor, and then the legislature has stepped in to help. The legislature this year appropriated funds for both McNeese, Southeastern, Nicholls, and UNO to help them not just with their physical recovery from these hurricanes and these storms, but with their community recovery. And it has been, I think, when we look back on this 10 years from now, it's going to be with a decidedly different eye than we had for the hurricanes in the mid-2000s. Yes, ma'am.
I was wondering how you feel about tenure for faculty members and whether you think there should be any changes to the way the system operates now, and if so, what type of changes?
So, you know, it's great. We're going to have a conversation about that now that you bring it up. Senator Kathy from Monroe area passed a study resolution to study tenure. And you know what, conversations are always welcome. We testified at every stage of that bill as it moved through that you can study something, but we know what the outcome is going to produce. And that outcome is an unequivocal attestation that indeterminate tenure is essential to academic freedom and the mission of colleges and universities. And any study that looks at history of the academy, that's why I mentioned Galileo being imprisoned for the rest of his life for suggesting something that contrasted with conventional wisdom. We want scientists free to explore and to uncover new understanding, even if that understanding is hard for us to grasp from what we understand today. And so I'm looking forward to that conversation. Our faculty senates from our 9 institutions have selected their representative, Dr. Phil Otter from University of Louisiana at Lafayette. I will be representing the UL system. I think the other nominees will be in soon, and we'll begin that conversation. And listen, it's going to be an open, free-flowing, freewheeling conversation about tenure. And at the end of the day, truth usually wins when you have honest discourse and good faith, and I have no doubt that that's going to be the case in this scenario.
Do you know how many of your faculty members, like a rough either a percent or something, have tenure?
About 38% of our faculty have indeterminate tenure, another 22% on the tenure path, and the others are what we consider, or we call contingent faculty, or faculty that usually work on one-year appointments. And listen, some folks prefer to work in that relationship, and that's fine. A lot of times these arguments about tenure center around what is broadcast across social media and that's the extremes, extreme positions. And it can be extreme positions on the right or extreme positions on the left, and that's what gets the attention. And people believe that the academy is there to indoctrinate students behind this leftist ideology. I'll be honest, when I was a student at Northwestern, I considered myself a conservative activist. And I went begging to find a leftist who would try to indoctrinate me, and I couldn't find them. All I found were faculty members who probably had a decidedly different belief system than I, who just challenged me to think critically about the way that I approached issues. And those truths that I held, that I still consider truths, I have a deeper understanding of why they're truths. That's part of the academic experience, and it is challenging. And I get that why it creates some angst amongst the general public. But I think at the end of the day, you're going to see that our faculty are the ones that overcame the impossible, and in 2 weeks' time pivoted from being traditional universities to being online and taking care of students. Those faculty deserve our respect and our support.
But aren't you concerned a little bit about the tenor of bringing up the cabinet resolution was to cripple some of the tenure of
So there's been a lot of folks that have expressed that concern, that Senator Kathy bringing this bill up suggested something else. I will tell you, in other states, they didn't bother with study resolutions. They implemented solutions. In fact, in South Carolina, they actually introduced a bill that was titled End Academic Tenure Bill, which is considerably different from a study on tenure. And when you read the first 5 whereas clauses in this resolution, they're as strong of support of tenure as I've ever seen. They do have, in the second 2 clauses, a couple of lines that I would probably change. Excuse me. But no, I'm not concerned. And again, because I know the parties, and I believe it's going to be an open, honest discussion. And at the end of the day, we're going to advance policy, and I believe indeterminate tenure will be here to stay. Yes, sir.
The Robert Lewis program sounds like an exciting event. Is he was he a resident of Louisiana?
He was not. He was a resident of New York when he passed away. He passed away far too early. He was in his early 50s. He was a part-time resident of Paris. He was a Francophile, loved to study abroad. But he was not. But his touch, his footprint was global. And his example is worthy, I think, of support from all around. Yes, sir.
Might be an unusual question, but if you were absolutely certain that you should be granted one wish that will allow you to do your job to the absolute utmost capacity, what would that wish be?
Oh, my goodness. Omniscience. You know, I think I look at where we've been over the last 15 years in higher education, and especially over the last 6 or 7. And we've started to reinvest in significant ways in our education. I think if I had the wish, it would be the ability. Sometimes I feel like Cassandra, you know, the Cassandra system, where you're advocating the truth as passionately as you can, but you're guaranteed that nobody will believe you. We talk a lot about future of work and how technology, automation, robotics, artificial intelligence are changing the very nature of everything that we do. And there's so many among us that just can't get their arms around that and they don't believe it. I think there's not been a more prescient challenge for us than future of work. And if you want to see it on display, it's on display now. From 2011 to 2019, work hours in the Gulf of Mexico decreased by 40%. Over that same period of time, output from the Gulf of Mexico, measured in barrels of oil, increased by 40%. The only way you do that is with technology. The problem is that technology curve is only accelerating, going up. And it is incumbent upon us as a state and as a people and as communities to educate our people. I wish people would convince themselves that argument was true. and then we would prioritize our investments based on that nature. Hope that's fair. Thank you, sir. Yes, ma'am.
So there's been, this is also going to be an unusual question, or not something I asked about a lot. There's been a big controversy that's gotten a lot of national attention regarding the Grambling State volleyball team and coach. And for people who don't know, Grambling hired this volleyball coach. She allegedly dismissed all the members of the team, including a lot of people who were on scholarship. And she has since been fired. But initially, Grambling seemed to say that that was a decision that she was free to make,
Sure.
just dismissing the players. And I think the concern, at least my concern, was like people who are juniors or seniors, you know, now they've lost their scholarship to go to school there. That seems like kind of a rough thing to do, especially when it's the entire team. So I was wondering if you could comment on that situation and whether you think that this is an appropriate thing for a coach in the UL system to do. It's just wholesale scuttle the team.
Yeah. So let me approach that in a couple of ways. One, on the specifics of this coach and this action. Of course, out of respect for her and respect for employment policy and rules, I don't want to comment too directly on that. I will tell you that those decisions are delegated to our presidents, and the presidents always consult with me on most cases. And when they are doing an external review of their program, and associated with that review, they decided that this was the best path for them to take. And I support President Gallo on that. But in athletics in general, you know, it's often in athletics, it used to be when a coach would leave and go to another institution, the students would have to request a waiver so they could transfer to go to that institution. And athletic directors were always pounding these students saying, no, you committed to a school, you didn't commit to a coach. And so we don't want to sign this waiver. Well, now the transfer rules have been changed immensely. And that loyalty to a school is kind of been diluted, I think, from both sides. With name, image, and likeness, you have student athletes that are going to the best offer that's out there. And I'll be honest, I testified in support of name, image, and likeness bills in Louisiana because I think it's important that student athletes across the board, I think of Shakyla Hill, who got 2 quadruple doubles as a basketball player at Grambling State. Now, she has more than all other males in collegiate basketball together in the history of collegiate basketball. It's never done. She deserved to be compensated for the use of her name, image, and likeness. I think that's important. But we've diluted this loyalty to institutions. It doesn't ever absolve us from doing the right thing. And we have our President's Retreat at the end of this month. It's always the last weekend in July. All presidents will come in. We'll talk about operational concerns and programmatic things. But there's a component of this one about being leaders of character and about using an ethical basis for your decision making. Because sometimes there are things you're allowed to do that you shouldn't. And we're going to have that conversation, and I think that's really the important part of this, is ensuring we have leaders of character throughout our organizations. Yes, sir.
There's been a great deal of comment in the national press about how many campuses are basically becoming entrepreneurial in the sense of setting up NIL workshops and programs or subsidiaries that are basically selling a consultancy to their athletes. How do you all approach that kind of thing?
Well, so you know, you've got different levels of athletics, and you have different levels of resource bases, and you think of what we call the Power 5 conferences, which I guess they're probably the Power 4 now. I don't know if they've got a designation yet. You can lose USC and UCLA. I'm not sure that adding New Mexico State or whoever they're going to add really compensates for that. But you have this level of football, and you know, for us, we distinguish FBS football versus FCS football. We have 3 FBS teams: ULM, Louisiana Tech, and of course, Louisiana's only nationally ranked football team at UL Lafayette. Wait, this is the Baton Rouge Press Club. I'm sorry, I thought this was the Louisiana Press Club. Right? So there's different levels of abilities, different markets for these student athletes. I do think that the NCAA is going to have to step in and create a more rigid, more substantive framework around this to protect college athletes, to protect institutions, to protect the character of sport. I don't know what that is. They haven't shown that willingness for the last decade or more. But I think, necessity is the mother of invention. I think they're going to have to if we're going to enjoy amateur college sports like we always have, and at the same time, do justice by student athletes. Hope that's fair. Yes, sir.
How is critical race theory used at UL colleges?
I was afraid he was going to ask me about the Dobbs decision. I'm glad it's an easy question on critical race theory. That's easy. So, it is critical race theory it was a concept that was really taught in law schools, and it was about taking a critical view of the status of various people based on race. And it has morphed into a popular slogan, a slogan in popular culture that has taken on a form of its own that I don't know where it's supported in literature. So critical race theory is saying, okay, if I put on a different lens and I view this from a different perspective, how do all of these moments in history impact different groups of citizens in different ways? Now, I started this conversation with you talking about the First Amendment and how important the First Amendment is, and how if you go to any other country, that freedom of press doesn't exist anywhere to the degree that it does in the United States, or the freedom of speech, or the right to a lawyer, or equal protection of the law. And all of these things that have been embedded in our Constitution since 1789. Remember, I said France is on their 9th republic, we're still on our 1st. And how these founding documents and all these momentous occurrences in the foundation of America are something we should all take great pride in. But it doesn't hurt for us to reflect and say, you know what, during this process, as we try to live the promise that was in those founding documents, some have fared better than others. And that we need to understand the reasons why we had different practices in lending, and what the repercussions of those were, and why that might help you understand why there's an elevated divided highway on Claiborne Avenue that used to be a boulevard where people could gather in the median and enjoy community and enjoy life. And why was it put there? I think those are legitimate questions for us to study. But when you label them, like with a CRT designation, then all of a sudden they become a caricature that you can battle against. I want to ensure that we're preparing students with the understanding of why, in many ways, we are the promise of freedom that is exemplified in our founding documents, but to understand that it's an eternal struggle that we have not finished with yet.
Well, you mentioned that the academic mechanism of CRT started with the law schools, and that is true, but most of the work now is in education schools. Is CRT used at UL?
I don't know of a single school that uses CRT as part of the curriculum. I do think that all of our schools challenge people to be creative and critical problem solvers. And creative and critical thinking means that you're evaluating issues from all perspectives, or as many perspectives as you can. And so to the extent that we're using creative thinking, absolutely. Are we indoctrinating people that any race or any ethnicity is better than others, or that they're responsible for anything as individuals? Absolutely not.
And are you teaching more African American history in your U.S. district?
I think that's one of the, are we teaching more African American history? I think that's one of the great things that has happened at our institutions as we've added to the curriculum and the reading list. I think the great books are absolutely essential, right? But I also want to read Maya Angelou, right? And I want to read Langston Hughes and understand the art that came out of the Harlem Renaissance. Why would you not want to? That's some of the best artistry and best writing and the best expressions of the human condition that have ever been published. And so to exclude them must come from a place that's not as constructive as or is not as dedicated to the educational process as we want to be. So absolutely, I think you've seen some diversification of the curriculum.
I think we've run out of time. Thank you very much.
Oh, were you asking me about Dobbs? I'm just kidding. Thank y'all very much. Appreciate you.